What if I told you one of the most powerful brands on earth started in the trunk of a car? What if the billion-dollar swoosh almost never existed at all? Before global endorsements and Super Bowl ads, there was just a young man chasing runners with a box of shoes. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, he didn't even own a store. He had debt, doubt, and a crazy belief that he could beat the giants. That young man was Phil Knight. Today his company is worth over $100 billion, but in the beginning, he was driving around selling sneakers one pair at a time. No investors lined up, no one predicted domination. Most people thought he was wasting his time. This is the story of how a trunk full of shoes became Nike, and how obsession turned into a global empire. Phil Knight was not born into a sports dynasty or a fashion empire. He grew up in Oregon with a competitive spirit and a restless mind. He loved running, but he was not a superstar athlete. He was curious about performance and how small improvements could create big advantages. After college, he served in the Army and then pursued business school. It was at Stanford that an idea began to form. He wrote a paper about importing high-quality running shoes from Japan. At the time, German brands dominated the market. Companies like Adidas controlled the track world. Phil believed Japanese manufacturers could compete at a lower price. It sounded simple on paper, but turning a classroom idea into reality required risk. He decided to test his theory instead of shelving it. That decision would change his life forever. With little money and a lot of belief, Phil traveled to Japan. There he discovered a company called Onitsuka Tiger. He convinced them he could distribute their shoes in the United States. He did not have warehouses or employees. He barely had a company, but he had confidence and a vision. On the flight home, he realized he had just promised more than he actually had. He needed a partner who understood running at a deeper level. That partner would be his former track coach, Bill Bowerman. Bowerman was obsessed with improving athletic performance. He experimented constantly with shoe design. Together they formed a small company called Blue Ribbon Sports. There were no grand openings or flashy announcements. There was only hustle. Phil stored the first shipment of shoes in his parents' house. He loaded boxes into the trunk of his Plymouth Valiant. Then he drove to track meets across California and Oregon. He would open the trunk and pitch runners directly. Sometimes he made sales. Sometimes he drove home discouraged, but he kept showing up. He listened to athletes and learned what they liked and hated. Every conversation became market research. Every rejection became fuel. He was not building hype, he was building relationships. Slowly, word began to spread. Blue Ribbon Sports started gaining traction. Bill Bowerman was not satisfied with just selling imported shoes. He wanted to improve them. He tore shoes apart at his kitchen table, experimented with rubber, cushioning, and grip. One morning he poured rubber into his wife's waffle iron. The result was a new sole pattern that grip tracks better. It looked strange, but it worked. That waffle sole would become iconic. Innovation was becoming their advantage. They were no longer just distributors. They were creators. Tension began to grow with Onitsuka Tiger. Phil realized they needed independence. The dream was getting bigger. The partnership with Onitsuka Tiger eventually collapsed. Legal battles and uncertainty followed. For a small company, this could have been the end. They had built their early success on someone else's product. Now they needed their own identity. They needed a new name. They needed a new logo. They needed courage. One employee suggested the name Nike. It was inspired by the Greek goddess of victory. The name felt bold and powerful. Phil was not immediately convinced. But time was short, so they moved forward. A new chapter began. A design student named Carolyn Davidson created the famous swoosh. She was paid only $35 for the logo. At the time, it was just a quick graphic. No one knew it would become one of the most recognized symbols in history. The swoosh represented motion and speed. It felt simple yet powerful. Phil said he did not love it at first, but he believed it would grow on him. What mattered more was execution. They launched their first Nike-branded shoes. The risk was enormous. Failure would mean financial Disaster. Success would mean freedom. There was no middle ground. Money problems constantly haunted the company. Banks were hesitant to lend. Cash flow was tight. Payroll sometimes felt impossible. Phil admitted he lived in a constant state of anxiety. He described those years as terrifying and exhilarating. Every shipment had to sell. Every order mattered. Growth came with pressure, yet the team believed they were building something different. They were obsessed with performance. They were obsessed with athletes. That obsession created loyalty, and loyalty created momentum. The real explosion came through athlete endorsements. Nike understood something others ignored. People do not just buy products, they buy identity. When runners saw top athletes wearing Nike, belief followed. The company aligned itself with relentless competitors. It was not about fashion, it was about winning. Over time, Nike expanded beyond running. Basketball became a battlefield. Then came one of the most important partnerships in sports history. They signed a young player named Michael Jordan. That decision transformed the brand forever. The Air Jordan line redefined sports marketing. It turned sneakers into cultural icons. Nike was no longer just a running company. It was shaping global culture. Revenue skyrocketed. The swoosh became a symbol of ambition. The slogan "Just Do It" captured a mindset. It was simple and powerful. It spoke to athletes and dreamers alike. The company expanded worldwide. Factories, offices, and stores multiplied. Competitors scrambled to keep up. What started in a trunk was now unstoppable. Success did not remove challenges. Nike faced criticism over labor practices. Public scrutiny intensified. The company had to adapt and evolve. Transparency became necessary. Leadership decisions carried global consequences. Phil Knight eventually stepped down as CEO, but his influence remained embedded in the culture. He had built more than a brand. He had built a philosophy. A belief in pushing limits. A belief in daring greatly. From selling imported shoes at track meets to dominating international markets, the journey was anything but smooth. There were lawsuits, betrayals, and sleepless nights. There were moments when bankruptcy felt close, but quitting was never an option. Phil believed in controlled chaos. He believed growth required discomfort. That mindset separated Nike from competitors. They embraced risk. They embraced bold marketing. They embraced innovation. Today Nike operates in nearly every country. It sponsors the biggest athletes on earth. Its products influence fashion, music, and culture. Yet the foundation remains the same. Listen to the athlete. Improve performance. Take bold risks. The trunk of that old car symbolizes humble beginnings. It reminds us that empires rarely start glamorous. They start messy. They start uncertain. They start with belief. And belief, when combined with relentless action, becomes power. Phil Knight once said that the cowards never started and the weak died along the way. Only the strong survived. His story is not just about shoes. It is about resilience. It is about betting on yourself when no one else will. It is about turning rejection into motivation. It is about building something bigger than fear. Nike did not become a giant overnight. It grew through calculated risks. It grew through obsession. It grew through relentless execution. So the next time you see the swoosh, remember the trunk. Remember the young men driving from meet to meet with boxes of hope. Remember the kitchen experiments and unpaid anxiety. Remember that billion-dollar empires often begin with uncomfortable risks. Phil Knight chose action over comfort. He chose belief over doubt. And that choice created a global powerhouse. From a car trunk to a $100 billion empire. That is the power of starting before you are ready. That is the story of Nike.